Hi, this is Sweet Life and I'm Natasha, back at it with the review and discussion of Killers of the Flower Moon. I first became aware of Killers of the Flower Moon a few months before its release. From what I understood, the movie would tell the story of the Osage, a Native American tribe who during the period of the Trail of Tears were relocated to what was thought to be worthless land in Oklahoma, but turned out to be located above a very large reserve of oil. And in the way that things were structured, there was this thing called head rights, which related to rights to the oil and its revenue. And so what ended up happening was that oil interests would have to pay the people who owned the head rights. As a means of protection, land on the surface could be sold, but head rights, which applied to the resources and minerals below, i.e. oil, could only be inherited. Because of the racism that was in place, it was assumed that the Osage were incapable of managing their own affairs and thus managing their own money, so they would be assigned guardians, in particular white guardians, whose jobs it was to oversee their money. Over the course of a period of about a decade, members of the Osage tribe began dying through mysterious means. One woman in particular, Molly Burkhart, would experience losing her entire family to unidentifiable illnesses and murder. As fear gripped the community, the Osage received little help from the local police and had to independently take steps to get the crimes properly investigated to ensure the murderers were punished. When I first came across the trailer for the movie, I wasn't aware that it was actually an adaptation of a book by David Grann. Once I realized that it was based on a book, I made efforts to listen to the audiobook in the days leading up to seeing the movie. I got to a point in the book where the system of head rights and guardianship, as well as the suspicious deaths, had been explained. I had some suspicions about the culprits and contemplated holding off on the book and then completing the audiobook until after I saw the movie to maintain a sense of suspense. I'm glad that I went ahead and finished the book before seeing the movie. I'm sure a lot of people are going to end up liking the movie, especially if they haven't read the book. But I ended up being totally disappointed by the movie. The information contained in the book about the history of the Osage people and this system created around oil is present in the movie in a condensed form. But the real problem that I had with the film is the way they structured the movie and who became the lead characters. The book is separated into 3 parts. The first part gives you the backstory about this oil system with regards to head rights and guardianship and how it created an environment where these people's lives were put at risk, particularly how racism within society at the time led to so many people within the Osage community dying through various means. You learn quite a bit about the history of Native Americans, this particular group of Native Americans especially. You learn a little bit about some of their traditions and customs, which I thought was actually pretty interesting. As a Black person, I'm very interested in Black history, and despite having gone to school here in America, you learn very little about Black history outside of the month of February, and even then, just about a few particular figures. It's much the same with Native American history. Despite that these people lived on this land before Europeans arrived here, we learn very little about them in school. In addition to explaining their history as a people, you then have a laying out of the timeline of these various questionable deaths and murders that occurred. The second part of the book dives into the FBI investigation into the deaths and the resulting trials, though I will say that the second and third parts of the book were my favorite, as the narration was more interesting. The content itself was interesting throughout the entire book, but the delivery was quite dry in the first part. The FBI arrives on the scene in the second part of the book, and that's where the real investigation began. As a true crime fan and a history buff, the book struck a perfect balance for me. At that point, it was pretty much a whodunit kind of thriller. As you're listening along, you get an explanation of the various deaths that occurred, and I began trying to figure out what was going on and trying to identify a culprit in my mind. At the core of the story, you really have 4 main characters. They are Molly, her husband Ernest, his uncle William Hill, and then you have the FBI agent who comes into play later on in the story, Tom White. And there's other characters as well, but those are the 4 main characters. Molly is an Osage woman, and she's the person whose family, where quite a number of her family members end up dying through mysterious means. Beyond that, you then have other members of the community as well. You have her husband, Ernest, who's a white man, and his uncle, who's kind of like a wheeler dealer in town. And you then have Tom White. By the end of the first part of the book, you have most of the information needed to form a reasonable suspicion about what's going on here. And then in the second part of the book, where White and his team, White being an FBI agent, him and his team, they arrive on the scene and begin to gather like actual evidence. And with them putting together this information, it ends up revealing that Molly's husband's uncle is orchestrating these murders for financial gain. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, like, where's the spoiler alert? There's none needed. The reason being that there's no real spoilers in the movie. The book is a different deal, right? But not with the movie. And that's where the book and the movie differ. With the movie, it's immediately shown at the very start that, like, who's behind these killings. Thus, it takes away much of the suspense. What should be a story about the investigation into these genocidal killings of the Osage for access to their oil rights and money instead becomes an oversimplified story of bandits and fraudsters. The compelling story is that of Molly, her family and community, and later White and his fellow investigators. Instead, you get a typical gangster film that places the focus on DiCaprio and De Niro's characters, Ernest Burkhart and William Hill, characters that we've seen variations of many times over. As I read and noticed the many ways in which the oil rights and royalties were tied to inheritance, it became clear that the likely factor behind these deaths was money, right? And Ernest had some motivation to gain control over his wife's inheritance and, if possible, to increase it through the deaths of some of her family members. The book builds suspense by creating a sense of danger within the community from an unknown menace. It seems that Ernest blindly follows his uncle's directions, but is never really directly involved in any of the crimes. Yet he's portrayed as being a stick-up kid and bandit in the movie. He's transformed from being a weak and mindless follower to a tough guy. Hill was a businessman who used his connections to politicians, law enforcement, and business professionals to carry out fraud and corruption schemes. Ernest and others are culpable for helping Hill, but he's the mastermind orchestrating the murder of various people to gain control of their head rights, inheritance, and to collect on insurance policies. Keep in mind that you also have this system of guardianship, where the Osage have this money that comes in, but it's kind of held in trust. And they have to go with their guardians depending on whether they have restricted or unrestricted access to get their payouts. And this is what most of them live off of. There can be a conflict of interest when an individual has money, but there's someone placed over them to manage the distribution of that money if proper guidelines aren't put in place to prevent that guardian from gaining control over or otherwise using the money for their own needs. I just explained the gist of the story, but it's not actually a spoiler, because when you watch the movie, the whole whodunit aspect, all of the suspense that leads up to trying to figure out what's going on, as you might do with the book, all of that's taken away. I think that because this is a Hollywood movie and you have such big names attached to the project, the decision was made to have the movie focus on Ernest and William as they would be portrayed by Leonardo DiCaprio and Robert De Niro. Where the book is more about the story of the Osage and to a large degree focuses on Molly and her family. If the movie followed the same pattern, then Lily Gladstone, who portrays Molly, would end up being the star of the movie. But I think in efforts to have DiCaprio and De Niro be the stars of the movie, they changed around the structure. Thus, from the very outset, the whole whodunit aspect is taken away because it's revealed from the very beginning that they're scheming to get these people's money. The book is an explanation of this unfair system and how it put these people's lives at risk. But then you have the movie, which dumbs down the story to put more focus on Ernest in particular being part of a group of thieves who literally robbed the Osage at gunpoint, while Hale orchestrates more veiled robberies in the form of insurance fraud and murder for hire plots. The movie devolves into a typical, cops and robbers film. It was disappointing because of the lack of suspense, and I actually ended up being quite bored with it to the point of dozing off in the theater. Part of it was the theater I went to had seats that were a little bit too comfortable. I just ended up finding it very disappointing because there wasn't enough there. It's like it moved from being this story from this moment in history about these crimes that were committed against these people to kind of making the story about the criminals rather than the victims in their quest for justice. It just felt very anticlimactic to me, and it sucked a lot of the life and energy out of the story. I saw the movie in theaters the Sunday after it was released, and I finished the book the day before on Saturday. And while reading the book, I got to a point where I was concerned, like, should I read it to the end? Should I wait and see the movie? Should I watch the movie first, then listen to the book after? So I kind of maintained that element of surprise. But I'm glad that I read the book before, because I didn't really miss out on anything by listening to it the whole way through, because they gave the whole story away within the opening minutes. Reading the book, I felt the structure was so much more riveting and enthralling. You got your emotions more invested in it. Whereas with the movie, they just gave away too much at the outset. The movie could have been better as it follows the story relatively closely, though some changes are made. But I felt that it could have been even better if it followed the same flow and structure as the book, where the betrayal is not revealed until about halfway through. Because if you look at it, part of the movie's presentation is that it's a story of love, but also a betrayal. But it takes away some of that suspense, knowing from the outset that Ernest is a bad guy who's really just using Molly. Whereas for pretty much the first third to the first half of the book, he seems to just be a regular husband, which lulls you into a false sense of security. Now, granted, I will admit that with the way that things were going and the explanation of this system of guardianship and inheritance within the book, I started to suspect that the husband might have something to do with the deaths around Molly. But it wasn't confirmed until the second part of the book, when White comes on the scene and starts to tie the various pieces together. And it's not until that point that you realize that this was actually a widespread conspiracy. That had me engrossed with the book, because you're suspicious, but a little bit uncertain, because Ernest seemed like a normal husband. They're married, they have children, they have a life together. So when it's revealed about halfway through that him and his uncle especially have played a role in these deaths, that they've been so conniving and evil as to murder this woman's entire family. It's devastating. It's upsetting. It's shocking. But the way that it's presented in the movie, where it's revealed from the outset, and you really just see Ernest courting Molly with an obvious plan to get access to her money, and they even discuss it, it doesn't have the same impact. Him and his homeboys are having meetings to discuss the various crimes they're carrying out. And it just takes away so much, right? It's too much is revealed up front, as though the audience wouldn't be smart enough to put things together and understand otherwise. This can sometimes be the thing with movies that have big names involved. Decisions were made to structure the movie to make use of the fame and popularity of DiCaprio and De Niro, rather than thinking about making the story enjoyable. It takes a complex but compelling story about the Osage people and turns it into a dumbed-down movie about highway robbery and this group of criminals. A story about the perpetrators of a conspiracy rather than the people affected by it. With that, it becomes your typical Hollywood shoot-'em-up, bang-bang kind of story, where so much of the movie is Leonardo DiCaprio and his group of guys running around robbing people. When to be quite honest, within the book, that's not really the sense that you get about Ernest. He certainly participated in these crimes, but not in the way that the movie puts it across. Within the book, he nor anyone else are identified as robbing anyone outright. And even with his wife, his level of culpability is a bit unclear. It's portrayed as his Uncle Hale was the mastermind of much of this, and he was kind of just going along with it. But then it's in the movie, they end up portraying him as being this robber. Not to say that he was a nice guy, because he did ultimately play a role in various members of his wife's family being murdered. So obviously he wasn't a good guy. But it's he wasn't this black and white villain that you see in the movie. Every so often you have movies that come out with a big plot twist, where if you're one of the early people to go to theaters to see it, out of courtesy, you kind of keep things on the hush until everyone has a chance to see it, because it just adds so much to the movie. Think of The Crying Game or The Sixth Sense, but that's not at all the case here. They just stripped all of that away. And I felt without that momentum, it just ruined the movie for me. And I ended up being really disappointed, because I was very much looking forward to this movie. I had it on my calendar for a few months. The book was incredible. It took what could have been a dry and very academic topic, this thing about the history of Native Americans in America and how society, being racist and prejudiced at the time, created such problems for them, and made it into a very interesting and compelling story. Like, you really get your emotions involved. The book did a great job with this complex story, and then the movie just oversimplified things to the point where, in removing the layers and complexity, it removed a lot of the emotional involvement from the movie. They unnecessarily dumbed down the movie for the masses and took away a lot of what made the book so special, shifting focus from the Osage people to these two characters and their criminal activities, whereas the book was more about the injustice committed against this group of people. Because it's Hollywood and there's a greater focus on action and things like that, it moved from being a true crime psychological thriller to a typical crime drama, and the result is incredibly disappointing. My mom saw the movie with me, but she hadn't read the book as yet, and she thought it was fine. But I sat there and was just really disappointed by it. I think it's a missed opportunity, because in part, I was excited due to Martin Scorsese, Leonardo DiCaprio, Robert De Niro, and some other big names being involved with the film, but this is what you end up with. I don't think I ever need to watch this movie again, but at the same time, I would highly recommend the book because it's incredible. But I would say, if you're interested in the movie, go ahead and see it. Maybe you might enjoy it more than I did if you haven't read the book first, especially. But I think that for many people, especially those who read the book and found it engaging, the movie might end up feeling pretty underwhelming.
Thanks for tuning in. To ensure you don't miss any episodes, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, and check out my movie review playlist. Go ahead and click the thumbs up button if you like what you saw, and go ahead and share it on social media.